Three, two, one, zero.
Debris from everything we've launched into space since the 1950s is clogging Earth's orbit.
The most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
So, today we have on the show Dr. Green. Dr. Green is a person of many accomplishments. He is the author of several books discussing topics such as space ethics, technology ethics, and even the moral theology of AI. He is the director of technology ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara and teaches AI ethics at Santa Clara's University Graduate School of Engineering. He is also someone who saw firsthand the consequences of technology not being used ethically. Dr. Green, could you share a bit about your experiences on the Marshall Islands?
Sure. So after I graduated from college, I went to the University of California, Davis and got a degree in genetics. And while I was studying that, I discovered that I didn't actually like working in a laboratory. I thought I was going to be a scientist. So based on that, I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. So I joined a volunteer organization called the Jesuit Volunteers International. And I went to the Marshall Islands for 2 years with my wife. And we basically taught high school for 2 years out there. The Marshall Islands were used for nuclear weapons testing after World War II. So that was the first really big negative impact of technology on their country. And now as climate changes and the sea level rises, they're very low-lying islands, not much more than sandbars sticking out of the ocean. And they're gonna go underwater from climate change. They already have yearly flooding events that they didn't used to have. So that got me really interested in the social impact of technology and the fact that human beings are really being negatively affected by some of the technological choices that we make.
Wow. I mean, thank you for sharing your experience. That must have been really impactful. Do you think this changed, your angle when considering the ethicalities of maybe space exploration and some of your other books?
Yeah, I would say that the number one thing that experience did for me is it made me realize that the ethical decisions that we make about technology are more important than the technology itself. And a lot of the times, it's very important to have technology because technology can really help us to do good things like medical technology and those sorts of things. But there are certainly times when we have technological choices, we have a dual use technology, for example, something that can be used for good and for bad. And then we really need to recognize that using it for the good purpose and not the bad purpose is a really important choice. And that making sure that we're directing technology towards good is something that is just such a high priority, and we're not putting anywhere near the amount of thought into it that we need to. We put a lot of thought into developing the technology itself, and not sufficient thought into the use of that technology. And that really permeates through everything I look at, whether it's artificial intelligence or space exploration or anything having to do with changing the human body or those sorts of kind of ethical questions like that.
I couldn't agree more. Especially now, we have so many ethical issues coming up. It's so important to consider. So I just wanted to give a little excerpt from the beginning of your book. At the very beginning of Space Ethics, you wrote, "Space is everything that is around and beyond the Earth. It is the final frontier of human exploration. The universe is vast, spanning billions of light years. In comparison, the Earth is a tiny place. Yet every human ever born has lived on this speck, and all human ethical systems have been developed here with this planet and human beings in mind. Our perspective has been limited." So, how do you think our current ethical frameworks and systems need to evolve to address the challenges of space exploration?
That's a great question. What I would say is that right now we just have a very kind of narrow perspective on the universe. We have a broad perspective in how to deal with other human beings, particularly interpersonal interactions and those sorts of things. But even that we don't learn very much from because we treat each other badly all the time, and it's a terrible shame. But once again, we tend to be very focused on historically human interactions with each other, and so we don't have a good conception of how we should be interacting with the environment. We don't have a good conception about how to act in ways that are very long term. And we don't have a good conception of how to act in a very big spatial sense, very large spatial concept of just thinking about things and making those large decisions. And so if we're talking about space exploration, we're very much talking about long term in terms of time and large scale in terms of space. Just as one example of that, the space debris problem that's around the planet. We have lots of dead satellites in orbit. We have lots of little bits of space debris and things like that, pieces of junk that are slowly breaking apart. That is a planet, or that's a problem that's literally bigger than the planet Earth. This is a problem that nobody in the past had to think about. Nobody had the power to put satellites into orbit around the Earth. They never had to worry about them turning into junk. On Earth, you can toss a piece of garbage on the ground and that's littering and it's not great. But if you go back, 1,000 years, it would decay or rust and disappear. If you do that nowadays, it's probably plastic. It'll be there for 1,000 years. If you do that in space, not only will it last for thousands of years, it will also be moving at about 5 miles per second, at least in low Earth orbit, in which case, if it hits anything else, that thing is going to be destroyed. So the scale is something that our technology is giving us more access to. We have just huge scales in terms of velocity and temporal, our ability to act in terms of time and in terms of space. And the ethics that we have really isn't up to this task. It's something that we need to raise, that we need to once again kind of develop in proportion to the amount of power that we have.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up such an interesting point because at first, when I was kind of thinking about this, I was thinking of, the future, like this is such a future problem, but no, it's very much here. Like this trash that's currently in orbit today is an issue that our current frameworks do need to discuss. So, in your book, to paint the possible dangers of unethical space exploration, you draw parallels to the age of discovery and colonization, which I find quite interesting. What lessons do you think we should take from history to apply to space exploration?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it wasn't that the age of discovery was not an ethical operation, in just in of itself. It had many, many bad things associated with it in terms of oppressing people and exploitation and slavery and all these horrible things that happened along with it. That's the first thing. It could have been, I mean, they had the ethics at the time even to try to figure out what was right and wrong. I mean, they had people who were saying, hey, don't treat each other that way, but they just weren't listening. It wasn't something that they could really conceptualize adequately, at least in terms of putting it into practice. And then there was this stuff that they couldn't even conceptualize. Like they had no concept of invasive species, for example. So all of these things have been traded around the world in terms of invasive species. Invasive species cause billions of dollars of damage to agriculture and to landforms and to all sorts of things all the time. And it's really, when I say landforms, I'm not like exaggerating, because there are certain invasive species that will turn a swamp into a grassland, or will turn turn a desert into, I don't know, something else, right? Or it'll actually turn something into a desert, turn a grassland into a desert, for example. So really, really big ideas that nobody could really even conceptualize at the time, because they didn't have the science, they didn't have the understanding, they just didn't understand how the world worked. Now, with this kind of second age of exploration that we might be embarking upon, we have the ethics better understood. I'd say overall the ethical situation on Earth has improved in terms of us knowing what are the right way to treat each other, to respect human dignity, to have give people freedom and all those sorts of things. But there's still a lot of things that we don't know, and so we really need to go out into the universe with a level of humility associated with us. So just recognizing we're not going to know everything. We need to, even that what we do know, we know that there's a lot of things that we just don't know. We know we don't know, in other words, and we really need to recognize that in humility. One example of this, for example, like I guess maybe it was within the last 20 years or so, one of the landers on Mars discovered that there's a chemical in the soil on Mars which has a very strong biological effect on humans. I believe, can I remember what it was? I believe it was permanganate. It was some some sort of ion. Anyway, if you expose humans to this chemical, it has a strong biological effect on us. And if we didn't take medicine with us to treat that effect, it would be potentially extremely dangerous. It could kill the crew of the spaceship if they didn't have the necessary kind of antidote to this chemical. So everything in the universe could be this way. We don't even know what's out there. There could be living things on Mars. We don't have any evidence of that yet, but it's quite possible. And that's just Mars. That's just one planet. There's, like I said, everything else is out there. There's just so much that we don't know, and we really should embark on this exploration with humility.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like especially connecting back to the age of discovery and stuff, there was those kinds of thoughts existing. We didn't really think about it much, but now we have this chance to rethink and go through it carefully in the future. So speaking of things that we don't really know yet, but we're kind of still figuring out, how do we balance the scientific and commercial interests in space?
That's a really important one. The first thing I would say is that very often science and commerce progress together because one of the ways you get scientists somewhere is by making it economically viable for them to be there. So there's that connection there. And also science, because science helps us develop technology, it also helps us develop new economic resources. So there's a kind of a reciprocal relationship between economics and science in that respect through kind of technology. So what I would say in terms of balancing it, that is that we want to progress on both of those. We want to make the science economically viable, and we want to make things economically viable through science and technological progress. But at the same time, we don't want to be harming the science by making bad economic or business choices. Prime example of this is that Elon Musk, for example, doesn't seem to be very interested in something called planetary protection. Planetary protection is the idea of preventing forward and backward contamination between planets. If there is anything alive on Mars and we bring Earth life to Mars, then we potentially threaten that, once again, with the invasive species example that I just gave you. We could reduce a whole bunch of invasive species on Mars, and that would be really potentially very bad for Mars's ecosystem. The reverse of that is also possible. If there's anything on Mars that we could bring back to Earth, and it would be potentially dangerous to our ecosystem here, that's a really big problem because almost everybody lives on Earth. And if we release something which damages our crops or which starts causing animals to go extinct or is a pathogen and starts attacking human beings like some sort of virus or something like that, extremely bad. And one of the things that the international community has done in the Outer Space Treaty is it says that we're not supposed to be doing this forward and backward contamination. And it says we're not supposed to do that mainly for scientific reasons, because if we go to Mars and discover life and we discover it's life from Earth, we're going to say, wait a minute, what does this mean? This is very confusing. Is this contamination? Is it something that traveled there naturally? Is it because all the life in the solar system is related? It just screws up science really badly. But it also mentions this forward and backward contamination problem in terms of the larger, potentially very dangerous effects it could have. So really, and to a certain extent, the science really has to take priority in terms of making sure that we are protecting ourselves and not letting some people profit while the rest of us have this huge cost of whether it's either destroying an ecosystem on Mars or destroying an ecosystem on the Earth.
Right. I mean, this industry is so unlike any other industry. It's so new, but I guess kind of old at the same time in the past century. So you brought up kind of the UN national, like international bodies. What role do you think that these groups should have in space activities moving forward?
Yeah, the United Nations is a difficult place to get things done in, I guess is the first thing that I would say. And one of the ways that it enforces the Outer Space Treaty, for example, is that everybody who signs on to the Outer Space Treaty agrees that they will be in charge of everything going on in their territory and that they will follow the Outer Space Treaty. If somebody from the United States decided to go and do something in outer space that violates the Outer Space Treaty, the United States would be responsible for punishing them or reining them in. if you're dealing with certain countries, they might not want to do that. And they just say, oh, whatever, it's good for the economy. We don't actually care about this, or whatever risks are out there. It's not a relevant thing to us. So that sort of enforcement mechanism is not necessarily the most effective enforcement mechanism. That's one problem. Another problem is, like I said, the UN is just really hard to get anything done in. That's kind of the major thing right now, is that especially with the Security Council, if you have Russia and China acting kind of in opposition to the United States and Britain and France, and you have to have unanimity in order to get the council to agree on anything, then it's very possible that they'll never be unanimous on anything, and nothing will ever get done.
That's kind of where it gets complicated, right? With so many nations, especially as you mentioned, if you have to have unanimity, there's a very low chance of everyone actually agreeing. So how should you kind of mentioned earlier with Mars and discovering life, if we do potentially discover extraterrestrial life, how do you think we should approach that from an ethical standpoint?
Yeah, that's a really good question. What I would say is that first of all, we need to protect it. We would need to also scientifically study it. And sometimes protecting things and studying them are in opposition to each other. So it might be a matter of sending a probe down to the planet, doing experiments on it. Those experiments might include destroying things. So you might be turning over rocks, or ripping things up, or putting things in a sample container where you digest them with various chemicals. So there is sometimes a kind of an opposition between science and protection, but those two things need to be balanced with each other, because you can't figure out how to protect something if you don't understand what it is. So you have to understand it. You have to scientifically study it. That means perhaps even destroying something before you can figure out how to protect even more of that. And if you're then in a situation where you say, okay, we have life forms on Mars that are unique, they're not related to Earth life, or even if they are related to Earth life, but they're just different, we then have, once again, all those questions about forward and backward contamination. And really, we probably don't want to risk landing on Mars, I would say, in terms of having humans land on there. Maybe we could still have probes analyze the planet, but I don't think we would want to introduce human into this environment, because they could get killed and they would never be able to potentially come back. If they got sick with something or were carrying some sort of Mars life, they might never be able to come back to Earth again. It would be perhaps a one-way trip, or even a death sentence. So there's lots of ethical issues here. And one of the main things also, just in terms of the value of this extraterrestrial life itself, is because it's extremely unique, it's also extremely valuable. And that kind of uniqueness, really, because it's different than anything else humans have ever seen, potentially, then we really need to treat it like it's, a precious gem, or something like that, something that we've never seen before. It's really one of a kind and special.
Yeah, I mean, when we discover something else on a different planet, it's kind of breaking all the rules or all the discoveries in kind of a way, because everything, like all our foundations, as you mentioned in your book, it was built around Earth. It was built around like what we know already. So if we see something that is so different, it would be insane. I mean, so what are some cons of space exploration other than, the cross-contamination that you mentioned, of like how that kind of gets confusing, that you think people should be aware of?
Yeah, the cost is always the number one thing, right? Which is that it's really expensive, and there's no way to really make it very cheap. Elon Musk has done a lot towards making it cheaper in terms of reusable rockets. That's a really remarkable, important thing that he's done. But it's still really expensive. It's not cheap at all. And so that money could be spent on other things. It could be spent on education. It could be spent on healthcare. It could be spent on alleviating poverty. There are many, many things that could be spent on. And so every time we're doing something like launching a rocket into space, we're not doing something else. That's just kind of a trade-off that's intrinsic to it. At the same time, if it's some billionaire's private money, then are we going to tell him that he can't spend his money that way? that would be, that would be somebody, I guess the government would have to step in and say, no, you're not allowed to spend your money this way. And that would be kind of a weird thing to do also. So that's one big trade-off. Another big trade-off is the risk associated with it, or not a trade-off. It's just a negative, right? It's very, very risky. Humans evolved on Earth. We have a wonderful breathable atmosphere. We have a ground to stand on. We have water that rains out of the sky. It's pretty great environment for us here. If you're talking about anywhere in space, there's nowhere in space that's suitable for human life at all. And that means that if we're out there, we're always, a few seconds away from death, basically. Whether we're getting just in orbit around the Earth, you're getting hit with radiation from the sun and from cosmic rays. If you're on Mars, like I said, there's that chemical, which is going to be reacting with your body and preventing your body from regulating in particular ways. If you're on the moon, it turns out that the moon dust is, it's like broken glass, basically. It's like powdered glass. Because there's no erosion on the moon. All the rocks, when they break there from like an asteroid impact, they just break into tiny little sharp fragments. And if you breathe them in, they turn out to be very bad for your human health. And this is something the astronauts, the Apollo astronauts discovered when they took their helmets off back inside their capsule. They discovered, what's this smell? We're covered in this dust and it smells bad, and it started irritating their noses and mouths. So once again, all sorts of things we don't know. I'd say cost and risk are kind of the two big things, and also the planetary protection issue with forward and backward contamination is also another kind of risk. So it's not just a risk to human life, right? It's a risk to everybody potentially, and in potentially entire planets worth of ecosystems, if there are other ecosystems out there.
Wow. I mean, I couldn't agree more. Those are incredible points that I haven't really thought about before. Dr. Green, do you have any closing remarks that you think you want people to kind of remember?
What I would just say is, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me onto your show. It's been really great talking to you. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for thinking about technology and ethics and what's the right way to use technology. And anyone who's interested in this subject, I really recommend getting into it, start reading about it, figure out what you're most interested in, and then pursue it, because there's just so much work that needs to be done. There's lots of space for people to really make an impact in terms of trying to direct technology towards its best uses.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly inspiring.